Hello, this is Roger No. This is what will be the first of two videos for our case study, an examination of, we'd normally say, Indigenous issues in Canada, Part 1. What I'd like to do here is to explain sort of, these are in support of the main 7.4 case study reading that's available on eCentennial from Chapter 7. In this first part, what I'd like to do is to describe what we call the first contact with between Europeans and the original peoples of what we call North America or Turtle Island. I want to talk about how life was prior to the Europeans, and that really sets up then a more deep understanding of the significance of what happened after the Europeans arrived. In the first part, I'll be talking about the way of life pre-contact, and then sort of at the moment of contact. Part two will see the story unfold over the last, well, it'll be a short story, but it's about 400 years of history. And we'll see how the various policies and ideologies and structures conspired to create the intense suffering of the Indigenous peoples. So to start off, pre-contact. Now, really, pre-contact, there was no single way of life. Let me also point out that the Europeans, sort of in quotation marks, claim to have discovered America. I guess Christopher Columbus in 1492, and that whole, just the whole, like, that's the start of the whole disaster. This idea that someone had discovered the land, when in fact the indigenous peoples of North America and this whole hemisphere, they actually arrived about 12,000 years ago. They came across at the time of the last great ice age. By the time, again in quotation marks, by the time of discovery of the Americas in 1492, it's estimated that about 100 million people lived in what is today North America, North, Central, and South America. So with so many people over such a great period of time and such a vast geographic area, there was no single way of life. But what we can say is we can say that they shared a worldview. And that is that the indigenous peoples had a worldview, a way of being, a way of doing, and a way of living. And that way of living was living with the land and the water. The people had a deep, deep sense of connection with the earth, the sky, and all living things. They believed that the land was alive and vibrant. Water, to the indigenous people, is medicine. If we think of it, we can live without food for some period of time, but we can't live without water. And their language, deeply, deeply connected to the land. Their way of describing, their language is like any language, built to describe the personal relationship with the environment. And of course, the language to indigenous people, no different. However, all the way through contemporary events, we keep coming back to the connection to the land and the role of language to provide that connection to the land. So, having said no single way of life, I will also try to capture a set of ideas so that we can have a sense for what might have been prior to European contact. Um, we would describe the Indigenous people's way of living as very communal, multi-generational. So where we might have the nuclear family, mom, dad, two kids, or anyway, so the stereotype, um, they lived in multi generational settings. And here I'm going to take you to something that we call the longhouse. Now, this is the inside of an Iroquois longhouse. I'm going to show you some outside some visions of the whoops. Well, here this might have been sort of life here at the village level. Several of these longhouses together in the same area. And we see here, I don't want to click on this for fear of it getting out of control, but here we see, multi-generational groups of people working within this long building, all kinds of different tasks going on. So again, very communal, village level. Life was at the village level. Perhaps 20 families lived in these long house areas. And so they live very communally. And I want to note too connections. Connections, multi-generational connections. Grandparents, very, very revered, highly, highly respected. The elders. The parents and then the children, all a very shared, well, communal way of life. Take a look at. We would also say that egalitarian, as we saw in that that picture, that representation. Many jobs to be done, and everybody very busy ensuring the survival of the communal group. Decision making is always a very big idea, and consistent with this communal egalitarian way of living, decisions were made by consensus. And I found this was very interesting, so I want to link to it as well. When it came to making decisions, the group sat in a circle and they held what is called a talking circle. And here's a bit about it. But uh, suffice to say that the adults, men and women, would sit in a circle, and when there was an issue to be decided upon, um, they would sit in a circle, and then we also have this talking stick that or a feather that would be handed from one person, the speaker, and then they would say their piece, pass the stick or feather or the object of power over. The next person would share what they felt about the topic. Everyone making sure that everyone's voices were heard in a respectful and attentive way, such that as the people continued to speak, by the time the stick had come around to the start, it was already obvious what the group's decision was on that important topic. So they would make decision by holding a circle, coming to a consensus. This is really important to see because as we move forward later on, we'll see that the we'll have a better understanding of the significance of some of the European policies that were imposed on the Indigenous people. For us to really understand that the significance of the impact, it's important for us to understand what life sort of was like prior to. So again, I want to emphasize a connection, very, very connected humans, multi-generational, different families, the village level, very, very connected with the land, the sky, the water, and well, other living beings, whether they hunted or fished. Great respect for other things that lived on Earth, realizing their mutual interdependency. Like all groups of people, of course, the indigenous peoples were extremely spiritual. Um, like all people, and we saw that in the acknowledgement of our use of traditional lands, the reference to Turtle Island. Uh, that is really a reference to the story of creation held by the indigenous people. Like all groups of people all around the world, humans have questions, and they discover or they create their own stories to explain the unexplainable. Over 12,000 years of, what happened? Was it a tsunami or a volcano or an earthquake? What causes these things, right? We've lots of questions and explanations offered, very complex um, uh, uh, explanations reflecting, and their traditions wrapped around and ceremonies wrapped around all of these explanations. Now, this is, again, like everything here, it's important because the Europeans took a look at that and just destroyed it all. And so we have to realize that, they didn't come to a land of no people. There were a lot of people here with deep, deep ways of understanding human connection with their environment. And that takes us sort of, if we understand what life might have been like prior to the contact with the Europeans, we now kind of fast forward to what that moment of contact. In the context of our story, we're picking up the moment of contact at the year 1600 with Samuel de Champlain. Now, yeah, and even this telling of the story, the Vikings came, like 600 years prior. Our story picks up at this point. And in the context of what we call today, what we call Canada, we're talking about the French arriving first. Later, the British would arrive. Um, it is valid to say that the what happened at the moment of contact, well, it was a French story. Um, there are different experiences, different moments in different parts of geographic Canada. Things with the French were probably not as bad as things got when the British were in control, but from this telling of the story, we have the arrival of the Europeans, factually the French prior to the British, but basically we have a whole set of ideas that characterized what happened at contact. And so that is where, we have the Europeans coming in, and now we have this us and them, where we are the Europeans, they are the indigenous peoples. And as we've heard before in the course, when we end up with this us and them, we end up with this idea that, of course, we are civilized, and it is they who are uncivilized. They are barbaric. They are savages. And those are the words used by Europeans to describe the indigenous people. Um, Notice how dehumanizing it is. Savage is like a wild animal, very dehumanizing. Now, not to justify it, but to sort of, to get our heads into the space of where the people might have been. I offer you this. This is an idea, an image of what things might have looked like. The Frenchman is Samuel de Champlain, and just sort of, I am the European. I have been sent by the king, and I am here. And look at me, look at my fancy clothes, the rich colors, the fabrics. Uh, it's clear that I'm in charge because I've got all the gold color. These are my workers. They have less than I do. We've got this idea of hierarchy. Now we have this idea of what the indigenous peoples might have looked like, wearing, like here's the stereotype, the bare furs for warmth, to cover their body. Yes, they had some aspects of decoration. You'll see in their shoes the moccasins, some beadwork there. But, sort of like, I have been sent by the king. I am here. I am European. I am civilized. You guys are, guess what? Not civilized. You are savage. Take a look at some of the materials they have. We'll come back to this in part two. These materials, the axes, the knives. Of course, the indigenous people would have had tools that they use for cutting. Usually, I think either stones or animal bones that might have been shaved off to, for a cutting knife. But now here we have these forged tools. Think of that mirror down here. Of course, indigenous peoples would have seen their own face in the calm water, the reflecting. But just imagine, here's this man who holds a mirror, and it's like these things are magic. And so we have, if you will, allow the mind to go a little bit. We have a situation where, we're civilized, you're not civilized. We can imagine how these ideas might have been reinforced by, seeing each other in the interactions, etc. So, oops, I'm sorry. Yes, and so again, whether they are poor, they're unlettered. These are words to describe the ultimately what we end up with here is we have this idea that the indigenous, they need to be saved. They can be saved, and we're going to be the ones, we, the Europeans, are going to be the ones who are going to save them. And what makes them savage, what makes them barbaric is, I guess I should have said this earlier, they talk funny, they speak different languages, they speak different, they pray different, they eat different, they look different, they are barbaric, they are savages, we are civilized. Now notice they speak, they eat, they dress, they talk, they pray funny. All of these ideas we might sort of describe as being aspects of culture. And those aspects of culture, and we talked about this before when we talked about race as a social construct, those things can be learned. That the skin color was not a barrier. So what we have here is we're going to help these people, and the reason they need help is because they talk, they pray, and they eat funny. We're going to assimilate them. That is, we are going to make them look like us. We're going to learn, we're going to teach them to talk like us, eat like us, dress like us, trade like us, fight like us, all of these things. And that process is what we call the process of assimilation. And you see it there. Then they will become civilized. We will have saved them, and we'll have done them a great favor, And so, okay, the idea, the concept of Eurocentrism. I come back to us and them, where we are civilized because of our aspects of our culture. So where there's a difference, but we are superior, we call that ethnocentrism, where there are different cultural groups and one assumes itself to be superior to the others. In this case, whether it was the French, the British, and other parts of the world, the Dutch, the Spanish, the Portuguese, all Europeans, bumping into indigenous peoples in faraway places as the Europeans explored the world. And here in the context, again, of today, Canada, North America, we have the ideology of Eurocentrism prevailing. So the Europeans seeing themselves as superior to the indigenous peoples, then the problem of help, we're going to help you, we're going to make you look like us, live like us, and in the end what we end up doing is destroying you to our benefit. And that's basically going to be how all of that happened, is going to be the story of the second video, part 2. I think that's all I wanted to cover to this point, and I'll see you hopefully with the second video. Thank you.